So how have things changed in 25 years?
How have things changed in 25 years? Okay, well, 25 years ago, everyone was in the broom closet. We start out with that straight up. And they were in the broom closet for really good reasons. And people, so one of the things that's changed the most is that paganism, Wicca, witchcraft have gathered a modicum of respect. Not so much that we don't still get, silly jokes about, pointed hats and all that sort of thing. But in terms of serious media, we don't get people who think that we sacrifice black cats at Halloween. So that's a huge, huge, huge sea change. And I really appreciate that. And I hope that, what we've done with our magazines, which have been available in mainstream stores for, a couple of decades, has helped, make that possible, along with all the other magazines that have been out there and work from people like Circle Network, who does a really good job, Lady Liberty League. So pagan civil rights are just completely different than they were. It's
so
just...
You think it's safer to be out of the closet
now? Oh,
now?
Yeah. I don't think there's any comparison. I'm sure that there are still places, and you still will run across situations where there's hate crimes against pagans or so forth. But, 25, 30 years ago, to even say that you were a W, a witch or a Wiccan, or even... People didn't have they didn't have a frame of reference. So if you were to use that word, what would follow would be an hour and a half of explaining that you were a Satanist. Nowadays, you don't generally have to do that. And in fact, a lot of people, myself included, who talk to the media these days, don't even include the "we're not a Satanist" line anymore, because it's A, not as much necessary, and B, you don't really want to set up the concept that you should have any association with, negative so-called black magic and stuff like that. So that's a huge change. That's a sea change. That's something that's really, really important. I think another thing that's happened, and this is not entirely within my time period in the craft, but substantially so, is that the craft has gone from being primarily passed down person to person to being primarily passed on through media. And I think that that is an enormous change. When I came into the craft, gosh, that would have been about 1982, roughly. It was very hard to find. It was super, super, super hard to find. I had, my experience was at the beginning of the second wave, which was when Starhawk's book came out, and the same time that Marion Zimmer Bradley's novel came out, Mists of Avalon, and Starhawk's First I read the Mists of Avalon and went, wow, wouldn't it be so cool if I could be one of them? Wow, it's too bad they lived, thousands of years ago. And then I read Starhawk's Spiral Dance within, a period of 3 months and went, wow, people actually exist like this? That's so cool. But then, of course, I didn't know where to find anybody. And as it so happened, I was a seminary student at the time at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, which is a actual academic graduate school. I was in training to become a United Methodist minister. And I got a work-study job at the New Religious Movement section of the Graduate Theological Union Library. And so then I started running across all these tiny little zines that were about paganism. And as it just so happened, I ran into somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew Marion. And I never connected with Marion, but I connected with Diana Paxson, whose group, the Spiral Path, and whose coven, Dark Moon, was the first coven I was ever in. In fact, it really is the only coven I've ever been in. And so back then, at the beginning of the popularization of paganism in the Western world, if you didn't know somebody, you had to figure out somebody who did know somebody. And nowadays, it's, well, we're everywhere.
Google it.
Yeah, Google it. Well, it's not just an information technology thing, but it also is a very, very substantial difference in how people learn the fundamentals of whatever path they end up on. It's a do-it-yourself religion. It didn't used to be.
Is that an improvement or is that a step down?
That's a step sideways. It's a step. It's an improvement in many ways, and it's a step down in other ways. And The ways in which it's an improvement is it means that people who might live somewhere that they would never find a practitioner, because everybody would be so deeply closeted that you could be living in the same house with somebody who is in the craft and you wouldn't know it. Those kind of people can find a spiritual path that's satisfying for them, and that's wonderful and fabulous, and it opens up all these possibilities. The problem is that it's very difficult in an internet information-rich world to know good information from bad information. I'll give you a concrete example. Chris Bradley, who does Confessions of a Pagan Soccer Mom, posted on her Facebook page the other day that she got added to a Facebook site against her will. She didn't want to be added. It was just people can add you to their groups, and you can't do anything about it until you quit. That was for haunted pagan divorce spells, which I don't even know what that is, and neither did she. We all got kind of a good laugh about it. And another person. I spent a lot of time on Facebook. We have a huge Facebook feed for Witches and Pagans with over 70,000 likes at this point. I don't know how that happened. And so I get questions all the time. And I got a question from the other day from somebody who wanted to know how they could get a doctorate, a PhD in Wicca, so that they could teach people. And I was kind of skeptical. And she said, I found a school. They're going to give me a doctorate. I'm like, you want to tell me who that is? Well, she didn't want to tell me who that was. But there isn't such a thing, really. It doesn't really exist. And so it's really difficult for people nowadays with a proliferation of information, some of which, frankly, I don't think is actually intended. I think there's a lot of charlatans running around doing stuff. It's really hard for people to tell. I get people all the time who ask me to do negative magic, or who have really Hollywood ideas of what magic is, and I think that didn't exist 25 years ago, really, per se. The archetypal idea of the witch goes back a long, long ways. And in fact, there's a huge fight right now in academic paganism about whether the W word really should be used for what we do at all, because of the concept that there's no such thing as a white witch, that the word witch really just means a user of bad magic, and that we shouldn't use that word, except for the fact that then there's the feminist revolutionary concept, we should take that word which meant this thing and we should turn it into a good word. It just becomes really complex. And so I think that's one of the things that's changed in 25 years is that back in the day, if you said you were pagan, which a lot of people did not, but if you said you were pagan, you said you were a witch, everybody kind of knew what that meant. Everybody knew that it meant something to do with the goddess, probably. And that you were, working with, if not pre-Christian, certainly folkloric strands of mythology. And now there's really no common definition of pagan at all. One of the biggest new movements in the community is heathen and other Reconstructionist paths. And I believe that those particular paths are a backlash, or perhaps a revolutionary step forwards, depending on how you want to look at it, from the kind of everything goes, white light, popular Wicca that people think they know what that means. For example, a lot of people think that Wicca means that you can just do whatever you want. People get the idea that there are basically no moral structures except don't hurt people. But of course, and ye harm none, do as you will. If you unpack that, it's probably at least as good as the golden rule in terms of forming an ethical concept. But if you don't unpack it, then basically it means go around, do whatever you feel like, as long as nobody gets hurt, which doesn't give you, well, it doesn't define harm. We could start with that. So I think what's happened in the last 25 years is that the popularity of paganism has exploded to such an extent that it's become a catch-all for many different movements. And now we see that people who say, well, a lot of people who say, well, I'm a witch, but I'm not Wiccan, which is a categorization I feel comfortable with. Although I started out in a more Wiccan path, at this point, I don't strictly, I'm not in a coven, and so I don't necessarily follow what I would consider a Gardnerian downstream path. I'm definitely polytheist, which is something else that we didn't talk about 25 years ago. Nobody talked about polytheism 25 years ago. The assumption was that the goddess was one giant figure.
So then it was very pantheistic.
This is from my personal experience. I'm not trying to speak for the entire movement, but when I started out, everybody felt that basically there was one goddess, and some people did or did not include a god. And that goddess was basically one face of, the divine reality, and all of these different names of the goddess were just names of the goddess. It was like, different roles, like you might put on and take off a different role in a theatrical sense, but they were all one person. And so that's almost a monotheistic sense of the goddess. And I still kind of think of the goddess that way. But then I've also had experiences with different deities that leads me to believe that that's a little bit too monistic. But nobody talked about those things. Everybody just believed in the goddess. And then you would get people, and it's still very popular in, goddess movement theology, to talk that way as there being one goddess. What Reconstructionists have brought to the scene is a more classical pattern of thinking about deity as being genuinely differentiated, not just multifaceted, not just, the goddess is like this sometimes and the goddess is like sometimes, but actually that these are different people. And that's a huge change. And this last summer we had some pretty good sized screaming fights on Pagan Square, which is our huge blogosphere, between people who had very, very different concepts of deity. Something else that I think has happened in the last 25 years is we've seen, in addition to hard polytheism, to the creation of concepts about goddess or God that are multifaceted and in fact say that they are very, very different people, is that we are now starting to see a movement of people who are not deistic at all. Atheist pagans, Gaians, people who resonate with the cultural norms of mainstream paganism, but who do not necessarily think of deity as being something real in the real world. So archetypal pagans are a big deal. And so we got the archetypal pagans on Pagan Square, and we had the hard polytheists on Pagan Square, and damn if we didn't start doing a calico dog and gingham cat routine with them tearing each other to shreds, and being a Libra, and I'm not really happy with that kind of level of vitriol that I was really seeing. But we didn't have those discussions 25 years ago. Nobody, we're starting to get to the period where we are trying to kind of nail down our theology. We're a very young religious movement. We're definitely a new religious movement. I see the kinds of arguments and battles that are going on right now being very similar to those that happen in a second or third generation of any new religious movement. What's normative? Who's in? Who's out? All of this kind of stuff, which is uncomfortable, but also really fascinating if you're a sociology of religion nut like I am, as being normal, but it's really painful. There's a lot of pain right now in the pagan blogosphere. Now, of course, you can't tell what normal people are thinking because they don't speak up very often. I think most ordinary average pagans don't spend a lot of time thinking about, the normative reality of hard polytheism versus the archetypal psychology of Jungian. I don't think a lot of people spend a lot of time worrying about that stuff. But it's the kind of stuff that people who are really engaged in religion intellectually spend a lot of time thinking about. And so that's what shows up in the blogosphere, because guess what? When you open up a blogosphere, the people who show up and want to talk about stuff are the people who are really into it, as opposed to the ordinary people. I think for ordinary pagans, things are way better than they used to be. I don't think that you have to worry so much about whether people know you're pagan. I think that tools and gear and, incense and candles and all that stuff is much more available, so people have a better lifestyle availability. On the other hoof, a lot of pagans from my generation, we're all getting older, and I think that there is a longing for perhaps some of the structure that we may have rejected when we were younger. And paganism hasn't really developed those kinds of structures yet. I hear, used to be you put out, I've been asking these kind of questions for a really long time, especially in our core Pagan magazine, which started out as Green Man and then turned into Pangaea and then turned into Witches and Pagans. We used to ask the question, should there be pagan churches? And people were pretty much adamantly against. That seems to be changing. People seem to be wanting more of those institutions. I think that happens. I think that's kind of natural for any religious movement, because religious movements don't exist because everybody's happy with the way things are. Okay? A new religious movement means that there was something that people were missing from the old religious movement, right? You think about how many pagans are ex-Christians. It used to be all of them. That was back in the day. Back when I started, it was basically all ex-Christians. That was pretty much all it was, because the culture of the whole society in North America was basically Christian saturated. So you were kind of Christian by default. Now people are growing up pagan. And I think that's really exciting. And I haven't yet kind of been able to crystallize what changes that makes. But I think one of the things that seems to be happening is that there's a little less hostility to some of the structures that people associate with a Christian path. So I do think that people are starting to say, hey, where's pagan Sunday school? Where's pagan, who's going to officiate at my wedding? And I see that there is a beginning of a movement that is asking for those kind of services. On the other hoof, you still see people who say, basically, I don't want any part of that. If I wanted to do that, I'd be Christian. So there's more dissension than there used to be. We used to be a really tiny kind of unified sort of thing. Of course, there were witch wars, which, I was never a part of specifically, but those are kind of personality based, and that happened a lot. Now it's more ideological. I also think that there's a growing rift that parallels the lack of a center politically. So I've noticed that it's really hard to get people who are one side of the politics from the other side of the politics, get them to talk cordially or at least respectfully, even in a pagan context. Values are. A lot of people make assumptions that paganism is by definition left-wing and progressive. And of course you're all in favor of this and this and this, and you can have a nice long laundry list. But the truth is that we grew so much in the last 20, 25 years that we started attracting people who were not part of that pod, and it's really tough because, again, I've seen this mostly through my work in the blogosphere, but also in the magazine itself, that people may have really, really, really different ideas of what it means to be pagan. And in fact, a lot of people are now starting to reject the word pagan, and they want to be known as something else. They want to be known as polytheists. They want to be known as heathen, or they want to be known as witches, but they don't want to use Wiccan. So we have a more diverse and somewhat fractious group of people. I think that umbrella paganism will probably not survive forever. I think that what's going to happen is that certain groups will probably survive as actual religions in among themselves. And so it will become more of an inter-religious dialogue rather than an intra-religious dialogue. In other words, instead of people, I think paganism is more of a cultural movement than it is a religion per se. Because if it was a religion per se, then we would all agree on the terms. And I don't think we quite do at this point. I think we did at one point, but then we got bigger and bigger. And so we started accreting to ourselves more and more people who didn't necessarily match the start, you know, the genesis of it. Now, we could just sit down and do Council of Nicaea. Of course, I don't see us actually doing that because no one would agree who represented them. Paganism has a very strong, you are not the boss of me attitude, which is great for getting away from the excesses of institutional religion. It is not terribly helpful for the next step after that. So I don't really see us, you know, having a council of pagan elders and everybody sitting down and deciding that everyone will always circle Deosil. I'm just not seeing that happening. What I think is going to happen is it's going to be more of a question of a number of earth-based postmodern religions that have enough in common that they can, you know, help each other out in a pinch. I think that the likely paths that are probably going to show up, I think that Druidism has a very kind of specific place in the movement. I think that heathenism, which is to say traditions based on Northern Reconstructionism, probably will survive. And I'm sure that Wicca itself will survive. I think that that's a question that's really interesting because Wicca became like the, I don't know, United Presbyterianism of paganism for a while, and everybody was sort of assumed to be Wiccan. And I think what's happening is that the Wiccan movement is starting to kind of go back into being its own thing and not everybody's a Wiccan. And I do think that there's probably room for some identity-based pagan paths. I think that, for example, feminist Wicca or feminist paganism, the goddess movement per se, will probably survive in some form. I'm not sure about everything else. There certainly are a lot of Reconstructionist paths out there. How many of them will have the, you know, the ability to stick is kind of hard to tell. And then there's the whole question of lots of other associated paths. All the African-derived North American, South American, New World paths, I think those are going to stick. I think those have really deep roots, and they have something that most Neo-Pagans don't have, which is unbroken links to the gods that they worship. I mean, if you look at a lot of Reconstructionist paths, you know, people haven't been worshiping these gods for a long time. So what does that mean? A really good friend who is Reconstructionist Hellenist. What does that mean in a modern culture? How do you do, you know, Greek Hellenism when 2,000 years of cultural history are between the two? I mean, we're probably not going to go back and do it exactly the way they did that. Most Reconstructionists face a question of the fact that their paths were originally probably, you know, shared with everybody in the community. You know, back in the day, when we talk about Christianity being, you know, the default religion of the United States, well, yeah, everybody did it back then. So there were certain kinds of things that everybody knew what it was about. You didn't have to tell anybody what Christmas was. So if you're a Reconstructionist polytheist, how do you move and work in a world that doesn't have that? Where no one will have the vaguest idea that today is the X of Y and this is the day we do this. And I think there's also a real question of how we do group religion in a radically isolated world. If you're, I mean, Hellenic religion is just a good example, but heathenism has the same kind of situation where you know, these are religions that in their cultural context were based on the entire community participating. Whereas postmodern Wicca / paganism, everybody is their own priest. Everybody is their own priestess, which probably came from us all growing up Protestant. I mean, I really do think that a lot of the normative underlying thought patterns that we have were borrowed and were just picked up wholesale, probably unconsciously, from the cultural milieu. I'm not sure how much sense it makes to be a solitary in a Reconstructionist faith. I mean, that must be really, really hard. I'm not saying anybody can't do it. I am certainly not trying to tell anybody they can't do it. I'm just saying that, you know, paths back in the day were not practiced by solitaries. They were practiced as community rituals. So what do you do if you're not a part of community? Now, this is something that our magazines have been trying to address for years and years, because one of the things for, you know, people becoming pagan or interested in the goddess or so forth, because all you had to do was walk into a bookstore and pick one up and go to the counter and give them your $5 in cash or whatever it was. And all of a sudden you had an entry into that. That's a kind of a radical thing, I think. It doesn't seem radical anymore, because anybody with a browser can find information. But back in the day, that was, you know, I mean, we predate the internet. I know that's kind of weird. It makes me sound like I'm older than Noah. But it's true that people couldn't find any community. And people still tell me all the time that they don't know anybody pagan in their town, for example. And so when they get the magazine, one of the things that the magazines do is it creates a virtual community. This is particularly true of Sage Woman, I think. Sage Woman is intended to create virtual community. And I edit it and design it and put it together in such a way that it creates that sense. I was going to use the word illusion, but I don't think it's really an illusion. I think people, the Sage Woman readers, really do feel like a community. So we don't have fights. We let people fight in Pagan Square. People fight all the time. And Witches and Pagans, they fight some. Sage Woman is a fight-free zone. Because it's intended to be a refuge, you know, from the rocks and slings and arrows of outrageous fortune in the world. So you get your Sage Woman in the mail, you're supposed to, you know, open it up and read it, and you're supposed to feel good, and you're supposed to feel like you're connected to the goddess. And that's kind of the editorial mission of Sage Woman. So I thought maybe people wouldn't need that, but that does not appear to be the case. Our Sage Woman readers are just as strong as ever. And I get letters all the time from people saying, please, please don't stop. Don't ever stop. And it's like, well, okay, I do have to die someday, but we'll see what we can do.